Well, howdy, everybody. And even if you don't have a body, I don't have a body, just a sock. Yes, it's a sad life for me, Cayman Rascal. But sadness ain't always a problem. It's part of that complete Kellogg's breakfast, what comprises a reptile's life. As my uncle Alligator Al used to say, you take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the facts of life. Today, as guest host of them's Integral Stage, I'll be speaking with metamodern author and cave sage Adyahanzi on a host of issues that might broadly be called existential or maybe trans-existential. Meaning, death, suffering, ecstasy. This obviously won't be the classic interview format because as a freshwater Caribbean Cayman with a barely sketched out backstory, I lack the advanced brain function and emotional sensitivity to really bite into the intersubjective heart of Dialogos. But you know what? I showed up, and that's not nothing. I'm here, I'm willing. God damn it, I'm going to take a bite out of something today. So here to dangle wisdom in front of me like a chunk of raw iguana meat is Shri Adyahanzi, friend of the Integral Stage. Hi, Shri.
Hello, Cayman. Nice to meet you.
So, meaning.
Thank you for having me back on your
ecstasy.
podcast, sir.
More than welcome. Happy to have you. Meaning, suffering, death, ecstasy. Not necessarily in that order. Where do you want to start?
Well, first I want to start by saying that Adyahanzi will not be appearing as Adyahanzi today, but as Brendan Graham Dempsey, as I have made a puppet figure to speak through the voice of this character, which I have heartfully crafted and created, actually, in order to produce a synonymous work which I put out called Emergentism. And this character is sort of a mouthpiece, if you will. So I will be also puppeteering today, my friend. And so I'll speak like this, actually. So
right,
yeah, I'm looking forward to this conversation.
My arm is already exhausted.
Don't rob me of my illusions, puppet master. Do not let us see the man behind the curtain. Do not let us see the man behind the curtain. I guess I'd like to begin this conversation about meaning, because meaning is a very important topic to me. I write on the meaning crisis, and I care a lot about meaning, and so I think it's important that we talk about it.
What do you mean by meaning? Seems like it's got a lot of variance. Seems like it's got a propositional content. Seems like it has a sort of a feeling quality, meaningfulness. Seems like it might be specific, might be metaphoric. What do you mean by meaning?
Well, it's mostly a term I use in order to take advantage of people by creating a death cult. It doesn't have to be a death cult. It can be any kind of cult. I don't care. But it's very important to gain followers and followers on social media. And so I'm using the term meaning to refer to that, Cayman.
Oh.
I was very taken by the suggestion of Dave Snowden that we can use the meaning crisis to basically up our follower count and get people to buy our products. So I thought that was a great idea, and I salute Dave for suggesting that. I think he's spot on with pretty much all of his analysis, and I'm excited to be a part of this pyramid scheme. Thank you.
Now, is that sincere irony or is that regular irony?
It's sincere irony. Excuse me. It's gosh, I don't know. I'm not sure what lens to speak through at this point. I'll say, Layman, this is a character I hope you understand that this is not meant in earnest, Layman. This is some perspective being offered here by this insidious puppet, Layman. But I don't wish to reduce the quality of the conversation by losing it in the cynicism of some kind of farce or deconstructive pretense, Layman. I'd like to get rather to the heart of the issues. So you speak about meaning, you speak about purpose. Well, Layman, I have ideas about all of those things, but I'm not sure where you'd like to begin. Shall we start with simple definitions? I don't think an audience of this caliber seeks definitions, Layman. I think they understand in their hearts and their cores the importance of meaning, the importance of purpose. I want to drive to the core, Cayman Rascal. I want to drive to the core of it all.
Well, I think what an audience might require is a distinction, or a distinction leading to a mutual inclusion of whether meaning has some specific structure or whether it's fundamentally a qualitative relationship to a certain physiological mode, right? What's important about meaning? Is it having something that actually gives us a particular meaning, or is it having anything that allows us to go into the modality of meaningfulness as an organism?
Well, who's that question directed to?
The little one.
Go on. Go on, you've got it. Well, if I can speak earnestly for a moment, which is difficult because I am just a piece of paper being played as a puppet by a puppet. But looking past that, if we can for a moment, I would say that there's a couple layers to this. I'm currently working on a book called The Evolution of Meaning, which tries to frame the very concept in terms of informational theory as entities and fields trying to process information for viability. And I think you can look at meaning in that way and track it all the way back. But I think that what you're getting at raises actually a deeper issue, which is once you're in the realm of considering viability, the question is also, might there just be some, how would you put it? Just sort of an existential, ontological need or necessity to maintain some sense or semblance of meaning for the sake of maintaining viability, which sort of removes it from the realm of accuracy or truth, or even content. One could imagine someone might have a pathological commitment to a meaning where they believe maybe in some megalomaniacal way that they were placed on Earth to preserve the increasing quantity of women's shoes. Now, this is a rather strange meaning to possess, but if the contrary for this person was utter despair and nihilism, you'd have to wonder maybe such a meaning might be actually viability enhancing. So that would be a modality of meaning that is divorced from truth claims or ontological reality. It's sort of situated in the pure organism environmental context that would improve viability, let's say. Now, such things have boundary conditions because you couldn't have meaning in such a way that the viability was directly diminished, I suppose. So there would need to be some direct relationships, even still, between such nonsensical, bizarre, and constructed forms of meaning and the external world around you. But that gives you an incredible amount of leeway if you think about it, as many ideological systems of the past have been very bizarre. Various forms of religious practice and ritual have been, shall we say, not the most superficially obvious in terms of enhancing viability. So there's a great deal of possibility in that spectrum. But I do think to get at the core of the issue is the question of, can meanings be modalities that people inhabit that simply work to keep them alive and flourishing, but ultimately perhaps divorced entirely from ontological reality. I think that one of the stepping stones into metamodern thinking, at least for myself, and I'm speaking now as Brendan Graham Dempsey. Adyahanzi has a different perspective on this. He had a mystical experience in a cave, which he may speak about more, I don't know. But if you consider the fact that postmodern recognitions of meaning become divorced from ontological reality, or at least provide the possibility where claims of meaning don't need to be grounded in reality itself, then you can embrace meaning systems that are basically entirely arbitrary, but accepted because of what they allow an organism to do in terms of its flourishing and viability. Does that make sense, Cayman? He's trying his best, you know. He's trying his best, this one.
I think there are some uncertainties around how divorced different domains of meaning could become. If we imagine something like a Ken Wilber graph, where there's subjective, shared, biological, and systemic fit dimensions of meaning, and we could say in one scenario that there's always at least a minimal correlation between these domains of meaning production, or we could imagine a scenario in which these domains could actually fundamentally separate from each other. And then do they remain viable if separated, or do they move into a kind of degenerative mode where the capacity to produce meaning slowly breaks down?
I don't know the answer to that. But I do like that fine headwear. Tell me about yourself, Cayman Rascal. I'd love to hear some of your backstory filled in.
Well, I'm just a poor Puerto Rican river cayman who gained linguistic self-consciousness unexpectedly after eating too many carcasses of rats who done been experimentally dosed with modified DMT and flushed unceremoniously after their demise into yonder river.
That's what I thought.
My own state is a mystery to me.
Well, you said you were from Alabama.
I believe I said Puerto Rican and Caribbean.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do I sound Alabaman to you?
Adyahanzi hears what he wants to hear. You know, Cayman, this reminds me of a song by Simon and Garfunkel, which it speaks to the meaning question, which is, a man hears what he wants to hear and disregards the rest. Now, to your question, I think there's good reason to ask, what might be the role of a meaning system maintained that is untethered in profound ways to reality? And of course, our dear friend Nietzsche will be important here, I think, as he was very influential in my thought for thinking about the role that truth and the existential commitments that we make to life can seem to be untethered at various points. I mean, Nietzsche said that in some ways, the kind of mark of a person can be assessed according to how much of reality that they can take in. But that leaves open the idea that many people are going to cut off the reality tap at a certain point and allow for a certain veil to be laid over reality, the sort of Apollonian veil over the Maya of the Dionysian chaos. And that maybe this is really important, and that maybe meaning in that sense is profound and important still, even in its incompleteness. I think we're getting somewhere, Layman, because you see there are veils between us and the absolute. You see? And the question is, and the question I think as Nietzsche poses it is, what is the value of the veil? At least that's how I tend to think of it. How much of reality can or even should we let in, Layman? Cayman, sorry. I
Yeah. How, by what criteria do we evaluate the veils? Because on the one hand, Nietzsche spoke to the test of how much reality could be included in a system, but he was also very concerned about the pragmatic health outcomes of different meaning structures, and very critical of structures, social and religious structures in particular, but ideological structures more generally, that create meaning for people in ways that are unanchored to general social and physiological well-being, and therefore would lead to a progressive devaluation of those values on their own terms over time. So he's postulating some correlation of variables, which in the absence of strong correlation leads to degeneration of meaning systems over time.
But now questions. So why? But this is it, right? Because if meaning is understood as I do, that's a grammatical construction we'll parse later, then meaning is ultimately about connecting the organism to its environment in life-enhancing and life-affirming and flourishing enhancing and viability enhancing ways. So how would it even be the case that a meaning system that provides those functions could somehow be deficient? Or a better way of putting it, maybe, we're in the thick of it now, Layman. You see, one way of thinking is that reality presents itself in such a crazy chaos that in many ways there's more information going on in this chaos than such a puny paper individual like myself could possibly comprehend or deal with. And so we're forced to filter this through our own lenses, our own Umwelt. And so as a result, leave out vast quantities of very genuine and real information, but ultimately unsalient and irrelevant for my particular flourishing. So on the one hand, where we naturally, almost biologically of instinctive necessity, impose upon the chaos of reality this Apollonian veil, this mask, this puppetry, as a means to our own flourishing and survival, which I think raises a lot of questions then, which would be, actually, maybe the man who takes in more of reality is committing some deleterious effect on his own health. I don't need to see ultraviolet light. I don't need to swim in the sun. If I were to try to, I would be destroyed. And yet, if the Nietzschean man seeks to do such things, he will indeed be destroyed. And at what benefit to him or the world? One has to wonder if Nietzsche himself didn't succumb to a deveiling process, an apocalypsis of his own that let in too much of reality, more so than a man could deal with, much as Zeus burst Semele when revealing his ultimate glory to her. Maybe we, as wise creatures, should accept the limited ken that we are biologically attuned to, and only, and this is maybe the last point to be made, or maybe a question to be posed when considering human development, not try to jump to the absolute, but actually appreciate that we cannot jump to the absolute without risking dissolution. In fact, without guaranteeing dissolution. So maybe we need a successive order of puppets and masks to gradually work our way to the absolute. What do you make of that, Cayman Rascal?
Well, it seems to me that the absolute, assuming we allow ourselves such a concept in the first place, is amenable to a horizontal and vertical distinction, whereby one form of the absolute could be postulated to be the imaginal apex of a series of veils moving upward, let's say. And the other form of the absolute could be considered to be sideways from every veil, such that there might be an absolute that is useful and accessible regardless of how much reality you're taking in, and another form of the absolute that represents the unbearable totality of reality to which we can only approximate ourselves. But what came up for me was a set of digestive metaphors when you were speaking. Firstly, how could a system be a viable meaning system if it fundamentally lacked something in terms of success for an organism? Now, I thought of all kinds of things you can eat which don't have all the things you need to eat in them. I could eat Cheerios, only Cheerios, all day, every day, and I would succeed in being alive for some time, but there would be accumulating nutritional deficits because of things that are not contained, but missing variables in that adaptation. Along the lines of a digestive metaphor, and I'm freely changing my accent all the time, apparently.
You're chameleon rascal.
We can only take in as much reality as we can digestively assimilate. Anything more would be too much. So that allows us the potential to set more assimilation as a goal, but the thing we optimize for is integrated assimilation, not pure intake. Too much intake would destroy any system, just like too much delicious food would make you sick or kill you. But I think one of the things to which Nietzsche points is the notion that this is not homogeneously distributed through human beings, digestive systems, that some people are inclined by structure, capacity, and inclination to want to test themselves with more reality. And if it doesn't destroy them, then they become highly useful to the rest of the villagers in the mode of the shaman, although it sometimes does destroy them. And for regular life, people should be cautious about how much reality they take, but there needs to be some kind of intelligence within the social system that cultivates or gardens that to some degree. And I think this is why we historically see some kind of esoteric and exoteric mixture in most human cultures.
Oh, but it raises the question, though, of what is the good life? Because is the good life essentially the optimal condition of reality integration, or is the good life to be found in this sort of adventurous, risk-taking? What would be the metaphor here? You know, the bungee jumper of reality, the reality knot, the explorer of the chaos, someone who blazes new trails and pioneers into the void. It for me brings up the question of what should a human aim for? On the one hand, there'd seem to be incredible value in learning one's limits and then tending one's garden and then optimally sort of building up and improving the lot that they have and living within the confines. At the other hand, there seems to be this call of adventure to explore beyond the boundary conditions, to explore what might be called uncharted territory and go into the void and try to bring back in some Jungian, Petersonian, heroic, Campbellian way some insight for the people to carry humanity forward. And it seems to me there are at least two ideal types in that scenario, sort of the quintessentially ideal standard status quo human, which even by the very phrasing of it sounds derogatory and pejorative, but it shouldn't be. And the other ideal, which is this explorer of reality. And what do you make of that idea? Are there two types? Are there more than two types? Of course there are, Layman, but are there at least two types of ideal human capacity and flourishing? And one additional wrinkle in the mix would be, does the explorer actually live the good life, or do they sacrifice the good life precisely for the benefit of mankind, making them some kind of heroic savior figure? And what are we to make of that? Because isn't that asceticism, Layman?
It can be asceticism, but asceticism can be part of a good life. I think, yes, we need at least two types, and two types are insufficient to think about the spread of structural and neurodiverse typologies across human beings, all of which will have some variables that they share relative to the good life. They all need enough potassium to have the good life. That's shared widely. But at higher levels, there's a great deal of specialization in capacity. The good life will always involve some kind of risk, but the kinds of risk are extremely varied. For one person, sailing across the ocean to discover a new world, or a new world of the mind, of the soul, this Jungian Petersonian illusion you made falls into that category. That's a tremendous risk. But getting married is a tremendous risk. Having children is a tremendous risk. Going to war for your country is a tremendous risk. So the good life involves gambles of various kinds, not merely satisfactions. But there is a tremendous intensification of the quality of life that comes from the way that you comport yourself relative to uncertainty. It simply has to be a valuable uncertainty for you. And that's true across the psychic adventurers and what we might call the general population, or which you are tempted to take back the term status quo as a non-derogatory term. And I agree very much with that attempt. Being regular is not pejorative.
Well, I was tempted to say that in some ways we're forced to move beyond traditional conceptions of the ideal human by accepting the pluralism and the plurality of good lives, and considering that this integration process that happens at the collective level is a way in which individuals can play their part within a broader whole, doing their own risk-taking, boundary exploring, boundary pushing, and appreciating that these can be done and must be done in different ways depending on people's different needs. Appreciating that seems, on the one hand, a profoundly modern consideration compared to various traditional notions of the aspirational ideal human type, which seem to come in sort of one basic form. But as soon as that thought entered my paper mind, Cayman, I immediately realized there was something deeply problematic about it, which is that actually many traditional forms of thinking about this issue embraced the notion of the plurality. If you consider, for example, in the axial age and the whole notion of the different dharmas that people must embrace when you read, for example, the Bhagavad Gita, and even preceding that into more crude notions of the caste system, there was still a notion that people were in their own lane, forced to follow their own trajectory according to their own fate or destiny or lot, as you will. And that actually maybe the very notion of some singular human ideal type is not traditional at all. Maybe it's actually more modernist in its uniformity and conformity principle. I don't know. I'd pose that to you, Cayman. Do you think, is this a straw man or a paper man or a scarecrow that I'm proposing, that somehow this metamodern or even postmodern spirituality that would need to be embraced is more difficultly pluralistic than traditional spiritualities, which seem to be more monolithic in the sense of their ideal types, but maybe not? I mean, what's your take on that?
Well, as a Cayman, my people go way back. But what I've observed about humanoids is that their culture also goes much farther back than they usually admit to. What you're referring to as traditional probably should be classed along with the modern and postmodern as some kind of newfangled nonsense from merely the last few thousand years. Whereas most human culture, human living, and even human spirituality goes back hundreds of thousands of years prior to that, and probably included, when healthy, a great deal of diversity. Now, it seems to me most likely that something socially and psychologically analogous to biodiversity is probably common, standard throughout history and prehistory, and that it gets problematically reduced to something like a monoculture under conditions of distress, which could be social, psychological, emotional pathology, or could be imposed circumstantial stresses that require temporary reduction of the full flourishing diversity of the human beings. But along with Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, we probably should assume that the good life involves a myriad flourishing of the spirits, and that the job is to A, allow that myriad of flourishing, and then B, bring it into some kind of best fit coherent harmonization with minimal suppression or obstruction. But of course, that fails many times. And so a lot of what we inherit as traditional and a lot of what we see in the modern are relatively unnatural systems or unsuccessful attempts to do this.
Does it make you sad at all that you may only be Cayman Rascal then, and only be able to play out one ideal type? I apologize. I faced adversity and challenges which I have triumphed over. I am back.
They didn't kill you, they made you stronger.
Correct. Correct. Now, Cayman, what I was trying to ask you was, does it ever make you sad that you will live your soul life as Cayman Rascal and never be able to explore the human and never be able to explore the human possibilities of other ideal types of both the shaman and the villager, let's say? Or do you make some kind of accommodations for this in your metaphysics, where you recognize maybe that the self actually does have the capacity and indeed the necessity to play out all the various types in some kind of transpersonal trajectory through cosmic evolution, capital S self?
I won't deny that I'm intrigued by other options. I think the plethora of human types is very interesting. And I think there are probably a great number of types that the computation of the evolved human being has not yet located, that perhaps some version of AI or some other kinds of alien species might have or be able to locate that would make no sense to, maybe not even be recognizable to humans. It's uncertain how diverse the possible types and flavors of being might be. So I think it is of interest to everyone in various degrees to try to understand something about what those other types are and to hold open the space for alternative possibilities. However, that said, the fundamental situation faced by all beings is to be the universal in the form of their own particularity. I have to try to acquire a sense of meaning as this particular entity, which is sufficient to give me the feeling that I might otherwise project upon the greater diversity of types. If I can't live this one as if it was adequately universal, then none of the other ones would help me anyway.
There's very profound ideas here. The living as the particular the universal, one wonders the degree to which it's possible, but also, as I think about it, I think there is something particularly true and profound when I do consider those moments of ecstasy that I have experienced as being just that, a somehow uniting of these poles of radical particularity and absolute universality. The moment, for example, that I had when I was with a friend in Syracuse, New York, at a diner. We had taken a relatively small amount of LSD, and we're speaking throughout the afternoon of important topics. And at one point, we were at a counter in a diner, and I looked out the window, and the light streamed in such a way that it felt like, even though there was nothing particularly universal or absolute in the trappings and the content of the experience, which were all rather mundane. It was a simple diner in Syracuse, New York. It had this coloration of eternity to it, as though I were looking somehow or being bathed in the glow of the Empyrean, as though every aspect of reality were somehow leading to that moment, not in some ontological sense as a historical fact. It was not the case that, nor was it even my impression that my entire life was some teleological target aiming to this point, but rather this impression that beneath the mundane particularity of every moment is this sublime transcendence. And it gave me the impression that the universal somehow suffuses the particular in every moment, if we're able to, well, potentially peel back the layers and see it for what it is. But in some ways, that might present a different way of thinking about the issue than what we've been talking about hitherto, which is that when you peel back the layers, you find only this chaotic Dionysian void, an abyss of infinite possibilities, which is a terror. So I don't know, Layman. I'm not sure. Somehow there may be both, that the Dionysian chaos terror is also the divine Apollonian grandeur of the sublime Empyrean. What do you make of that idea? I believe, actually, speaking of masks, I wrote a book synonymously called The Oil in the Lamp, in which anti-Nietzsche speaks to some of this. Oh, shut up, you! Always trying to bring it back to himself. Go on, Cayman. Answer the question.
Well, it doesn't appear to me there's any special reason to associate the Dionysian with terror. That terror is already too Apollonian a term. We can't necessarily define the category of the transcendence of our categories in accordance with any particular affective category that we might long for or be anxious about. It's going to supersede all of those things. But I do think it's interesting that there are fundamental dyadic structures in human consciousness. I tend to call them metaphemes, structures where you can't think something without also thinking its opposite to at least some minimal degree. So if we were to think about the universal and the particular, we would find that we actually can't think one without also thinking the other. We don't really have that option, right? You always have at least a minimal residue of the universal in the particular, and the particular in the universal, because it's the particular is the particular relative to the universal, and vice versa. So the fact that our cognition is constrained in that way may tell us something about reality, which is that it's not possible to experience one where you're not also experiencing some version of the other. And we can undergo these experiences where we adjust the knob, so to speak, where we adjust the slider about how much of each we're experiencing in any given moment, but we're fundamentally always experiencing both. And I think one of the interesting questions relative to meaning and to a meaningful life is, how well are you integrating the perceptions and the sense of emotional significance of those perceptions that come to you through peak experiences? To what degree does your everyday life connect to, draw from, and remember your peak moments? What the?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think, well, there's multiple layers to this, I suppose. Maybe you'd say more about what's the importance then of integrating these peak moment experiences into the mundane experience? And maybe another question would be, would some kind of alternate ideal, or not alternate, idea be that we should aspire to achieve that experience of the ultimate in the mundane in every moment? Or do we just have these peak experiences to reintegrate into our lives such that the mundane can also continue to be the mundane in its own way without forcing some kind of preference towards the transcendent experience? I wonder, in some ways, what did you call these fundamental opposites?
Metathemes.
Metathemes. These
Themes. Metathemes.
Metathemes.
PH.
Metathemes. I wonder if these metathemes of transcendence and the mundane, or the immanent, we might say, hold. I'll put it this way, Cayman. There tends to be this suggestion that the transcendent ultimate experience is one in which it is fundamentally a peak experience that is heightened reality, heightened beauty and glory, etc. But in some ways, isn't that to privilege the transcendent metatheme, when maybe what we should be doing is trying to find their unity between the transcendent and the immanent, such that in some ways, what we might take as mundane reality might somehow be transubstantiated in our appreciation. Does that make sense?
Yes. And a lot of it depends on how we use these terms. One person might say transcendence and imply something that's the opposite of the mundane. And the next person in line might use transcendence specifically to mean something which inherently integrates both the mundane and the ecstatic. This is one of the classic ambiguities one finds in discussions of non-duality. Is non-duality a certain kind of unity that supersedes all differences? Or is it the thing which undoes the distinction between that unity and all differences?
Well, where does Cayman Rascal come down on this particular issue? This issue of issues, Cayman.
Yeah. It's not possible to separate the universal from the particular, or the sacred from the mundane, fundamentally, although it is possible to experience them with different degrees of salience. So we want to create for ourselves and co-create for our culture a situation in which we are much better at eliciting the visceral experience of these things and working them into some dimension of our daily experience. It's not possible, I think, to, in a complex universe of becoming, to fundamentally achieve and hold a transcendental position. But it is possible to increasingly integrate the transcendental and the mundane with periodic fluctuations of intensity.
Yes, that seems to make sense. Yes, I wonder. In fact, I was recently having a conversation with John Vervaeke on similar topics when we consider the polarity of something like a Neoplatonic context, and appreciate basically the ultimate. Again, there it goes again, ultimate, right? But some kind of a fusion between these two, of not appreciating the pole as pole, but the pole as polarity. And I think there's a fundamental structural mind shift that has to go on for at least people, myself, I'll just speak for, used to kind of more Western traditional religious discussion of God and the sublime, because it seems to privilege and favor one pole over the other. And there's something deeply attractive about that, but also deeply problematic. And at the same time, while it's in some ways been said to the point of cliche, chop wood, carry water, and then after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, there's still some sense that we're aiming towards something, and there is some teleological direction to it all. And there is then some sense of privileging some directional aspect of poles against poles, and not just the polarity space in between. And so it raises big questions about the spiritual life, about how we should live, about what we should value and how we should spend our time. It's all a bit too much for me, Layman, but then again, I'm just a piece of paper. And I'm just Adyahanzi, who, while not just a piece of paper, speaks through one. And you were saying, Cayman.
I think it's reasonable to suggest that the non-dual or transcendental, in the sense of the thing that integrates the transcendental and the mundane, that is closer to what a telos should mean. That we are getting better at and moving toward and increasingly approximating the simultaneity of the worldly and the divine. And this is, you mentioned Western and Christian forms of thinking, and I think a lot of scholars in that tradition haven't related to concepts like these, but in the symbolism of these traditions, we find a great deal of it. And this could be a good segue into the death and suffering aspect of our proposed discussion, because the image of Christ on the cross is the image of a hyper intense fusion of the mortal and the divine, right? That God is fully made flesh and the immortal fully dies in the gesture indicated by that image. So there is a fundamental recognition that some kind of metathemic paradoxical telos of the integration of these opposites is at play at the heart of the Western tradition, even though many of our thinkers and scholars have not lived up to that intuition.
Well, let me ask you this. I believe it was Augustine who said, speaking of God, my soul will not find rest until it rests in thee. And there's something that I deeply resonate with in a notion like that. There's a desire also to subsist. No, what's the word? To have a moment of calm repose from all this relentless dialectical fusion and chaos and jumbling and mixing of opposites. There's something that, of course, Nietzsche critiqued as being fundamentally nihilistic: the long sleep, the desire to rest, to end, to sleep, to dream no more, etc. But at the same time, one wonders about the hecticness, which I think is something that we can come to appreciate all the more so in these digital times, in this era of exponential technological increase, where we no longer know what's real and what's superimposed and what's a fiction or a simulacrum or a mask on a mask on a mask. There's a certain kind of exhaustion from the chaos of it all that in some ways it makes sense to imagine the transcendent pole as being that which puts an end or puts a stop or puts a pause, like the eye of a hurricane, to all this whirling, chaotic, satirical nonsense. And I'm maybe, well, sympathetic to notions of the divine, the transcendent, that speak to that desire for some respite. Do you think that that is fundamentally nihilistic, Cayman Rascal, or do you think that there's something to that?
I think there's a danger of mixing up the categories there in a way that can be fundamentally nihilistic. There are certainly states of consciousness in which the burdens of mortal existence and the perceived burden of becoming are temporarily appeased. And we have interpretive options relative to those states. We can decide that they represent the fundamental ontological background of reality, or we could decide that they represent something other than that. But I think the danger is that we take organismic needs and project them onto those states, and by extension onto those, our speculations about the ontological nature of reality. Because living beings require rest, right? We sleep every night. We require a certain kind of restorative ease that alternates with our activity. And if we're living in psychological, emotional, or socioeconomic ways that require too much activity, that lens our experience of living through behaviors or devices that are constantly distressing our nervous system, our organism, and our basic restorative needs, then we will feel uneasy and we will long for rest and peace. And these are, in fact, very reasonable things to long for and very reasonable things to actually gain access to in order to be a fully involved living organism of the kind that Nietzsche might suggest. But then, the difficulty seems to come when we take that organismic need and project it into the metaphysical firmament and pretend that this unaddressed requirement of our actual living will finally and only be available to us at the expense of life, change, form, and reality itself.
Yeah. But then there's something about appreciating the limitations of the human as sort of giving grace to the reality that, well, yes, as Homer himself said, and then there is also a time for sleep. I wonder if this continual emphasis on the drive towards transcendence somehow not just as hubristic in the sense that it seeks to blow past our limitations as human beings, but doesn't give enough charity and grace to the human experience itself, which is full of limitations and veils and masks and certain lack of capacity to appreciate the transcendent absolute chaos beyond our ken. I wonder if we need to be favoring a spirituality that is a bit more kind to the human limitation, the human condition, and not in some kind of in the way that Nietzsche would critique of slave morality, that we should focus on pity and that sort of a thing, though that's a different conversation. But rather what I mean is rather embracing the human limitation and the human mask and the human veil as being our own lens into the absolute and the universal, and not necessarily privileging the beyond, what lies beyond that. Because it is ultimately something you would have to say non-human in some way. But this is a question. This is a question, Layman. Is it non-human? Is it transhuman? Is it the Ubermensch? How do we make sense of our own desire for transcendence to move past our own limitations? Should we valorize it, or should we contextualize it within this impossible teleological aim towards transcendence, which itself might be a death drive?
Well, this is one of those areas where Vervaeke's notion of opponent processing comes in, which is a kind of dynamic cognitive science way of describing what a metatheme is. You can't have one without the other. So you have to find some artful way to move between them or get them into a more integrated simultaneous functioning. Heidegger has an excellent essay on Nietzsche's will to power, where the virtue of that essay, although there may be weaknesses in it, is that it specifies how to protect and identify and conserve something is inherent in the transcendental gesture, right? You have to have secured something in order to go beyond it. Those things are never separate. And all of us face that all the time. It's not simply the individual feels like it's within their unique capacity to dare into transhuman domains that faces this. Every child is in a situation of constantly growing and going through often agonizing procedures of trying to become itself by becoming what it isn't.
Yeah.
You're not born walking or speaking. That's a very difficult change. And yet it's the kind of difficult change that we need to pursue by alternating challenging activity, by trying to align our actions with something that's appropriate to the structure of the being that we are. Nietzsche, actually, maybe we're bringing Nietzsche into this conversation too much, but Nietzsche said you can't look around your own corner, right? He didn't say you should try to get over that limitation. He said you can't. You're stuck with the bedrock of the structure that you are.
I think actually this also raises an important point, which is I've been thinking a lot about the emphasis placed on development and growth and stages, et cetera, in the integral, liminal, metamodern community space. And the more I've thought about this question, the more I've come to the conclusion, however provisional, that when we're talking about these evolutionary developments, when we talk about these stages, I think the greatest limitation to them is presenting them as sort of a curriculum that is somehow open to all people to pass through if they only committed themselves to the task, et cetera, et cetera. We think about these things very much at the individual level. What stage is this person? What stage is that person? And even if you move past a lot of the incredible theoretical problems of reifying the stages as discrete units in that way, which various kinds of developmental models themselves take into account and I think resolve in a manner that more or less renders the superficial stage theory debate moot in many points. I think it's the application and the misapplication that really gets at the problem. But what I mean by that is that I think that this evolutionary process is not something that we should emphasize our even active participatory role in shaping or directing or even somehow consciously taking the reins of, where you really do start to then enter the domain of the various critics or critiques of eugenics and whatever. The more I've thought about this issue, it seems like evolution will go on apace regardless. That development is a fact of reality, that it is a fact of the cosmos, and that we might fumble this issue by learning about it, becoming reflective about it, and trying to get our grubby little hubristic mitts around it to direct it and this and that. And I'm also not necessarily saying that attempts to do so are necessarily misguided or wrong. That's not my point either. But what I am getting at is that in terms of utilizing this knowledge in a helpful way, I think it's important to appreciate that the universe that we live in is inherently complexifying, developing, evolving. And I think that we should appreciate that as a descriptive aspect of the cosmos rather than emphasizing or leaning into the anthropomorphic aspect of a prescriptive element towards how can people better themselves? How can we actively and consciously evolve ourselves, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think what we're getting at here speaks to some of that because as Jung said, God will be present, bidden or unbidden. Something of that lies in the nature of development, growth, and evolution itself. These things will play themselves out, whether or not, and maybe I was going to say whether or not we actively try to take a role in them, and I was going to add potentially that even our active attempts to take a role in it might just be more ham-handed intervention than is good for us. That maybe we should allow to appreciate that these forces and directions and trajectories and patterns are at work while being able to let them go and run their own course, as it were. Just a thought.
Well, I would largely agree with that, but I would suggest, again, the typological distinctions are necessary here, that for some people, the way for them to organize the good life looks more like a trajectory of endless self-deepening, right? That there's something common in the discourse around esoteric traditions that people want to play an active participatory role in the intensification of their experience of beingness. And that might be quite appropriate for them and quite useful in terms of getting them to play the role that they need to play for the general population. But that doesn't mean that you're failing if your focus is on adaptation to your existing niche. That, like you're saying, the evolutionary nature of reality is built into things that we might call conservative, even. I think one of the problems in discussions about the leading edge of evolution, quote unquote, is that it too often focuses in a, let's say, liberal way on innovation of new forms and neglects the equally valid conservative mode that looks like troubleshooting, right? When a structure is imbalanced or broken, you try to fix it. You try to restore its normative existing form. Now, that's a creative activity, and that's an activity that helps it be adaptive to the niche in which it exists, and the niche in which it exists is ultimately evolution itself. So it's updating itself relative to the background structures of reality. It's moving itself forward, but the foreground form of that might be, I just want to return, I want to fix this thing, I want to put it back into its normal and normative form. So I think we have a tendency, because evolutionary discussions are populated by people of a more liberal bent, to ignore that conservative tendency, which doesn't seek evolution, but nonetheless participates in it through adaptation to what is.
Yeah. Well, that's well said. Now, I think we've covered meaning, we've covered self, we've covered chaos, we've covered death, reincarnation. We've covered, to some degree, ecstasy. What is it that this smorgasbord of a conversation yet has to tackle, Cayman Rascal? What have we not discussed? What is the absent fifth?
Suffering.
We'll take it away.
It's interesting. My mind goes immediately to Gurdjieffian distinctions between mechanical, voluntary, and intentional suffering, which one might also relate to Kierkegaard's aesthetic, ethical, and religious stages of life. There's a kind of suffering that's built into merely living, into merely trying to exercise all of your possibilities and avoid suffering. There's a suffering inherent in that, and there's a way that suffering drives you to try to escape it and drives you to try to explore the pleasures of the world as best you can. So we might associate that, although we don't have to, with Kierkegaard's aesthetic stage. Now, there's another layer of sophistication on that, where you would recognize that there's a lot of possibilities you can only access by canceling other possibilities. You can't get them all. And some of the pleasures only come through sufferings. And you have to agree to certain sufferings in order to gain those pleasures, right? Like you can't get the pleasure of winning an Olympic race without putting yourself through a great ordeal in order to get there. There's a kind of a deal involved, an ethical deal. But then there's this additional level in which you might say that something within the experience of suffering itself has a transfiguring value to us if it's handled in the correct manner. That it's not that you volunteer for suffering in order to get something better. It's that you see something within suffering that might itself transfigure reality and move you closer to that telos that, say, the image of the crucified God-man represents for us. But that means that you have to undergo some kind of extra conscious participation, some intentional leaning into an element that is contained within suffering. This is pointed to in many religions. So that's my initial thought. 3 grades of suffering.
Yeah. Well, this is a very interesting topic for me because one of my chief challenges in terms of an integrative aspect is how to integrate notions of constructive suffering. I think largely the reason for that is that my very notions of spirituality were framed very much through the lens of asceticism and ascetic ideals early on, that moving beyond those, you could say developing past those ways of thinking, felt, while at first, of course, incredibly vertiginously confusing and disorienting, ultimately liberating, and I think progressive, to be able to let go the sense of redemptive suffering, this need to deprive the self, this need to cast aspersions on pleasure, etc. And so because of that, I've had difficulty reintegrating a sense of constructive suffering in a way that's not simply sort of old age, two worlds mythology, axial asceticism. And I think that this is an element that I'm aware of, but I have not yet found a mode that is compelling enough to me to really try to break out of this, at the same time that I recognize inherent limitations also in my own leading edge of growth, which is specifically around issues of discipline. As you note, that there are certain kinds of pleasure, certain kinds of rewards, gains that require an initial period of discomfort and dis-ease. And so there is, in that sense, even from a non-ascetic angle, a way of understanding the constructive or productive ends of suffering, which I can understand and would even be able to recognize some benefit in being able to integrate more. But it is a real block. And there's a pragmatic aspect to that, of course, which is, of course, simply dealing with the discipline issue of trying to become more adept at facing discomfort and dis-ease, but there's also the theoretical one, and I'm still suspect of that. There's so much suffering in existence as a given that it seems to me that we don't need to necessarily have to give it a platform, so to speak, to play into it, to even produce more of it for ourselves, for our own growth. There's a part of me that wants to try to leverage the existing suffering quota towards whatever necessary benefits might come from it, without necessarily creating more in the process for myself, of course. So there's a problem there, which I recognize. At the same time, unlike Adyahanzi, who is old and has lived in a cave for many years, and is probably going to kick the bucket very soon, I am young, and so don't necessarily have to face my own mortality as a pressing concern, and I do not have the weight of chronic illness and the urgency of suffering bearing down on me. And so perhaps I'm a bit naive and blinded to the realities that face me, that will be coming, and I will confront them then. At the same time, I also celebrate this as a truth, because in the traditional Indian recognition of the stages of life, there is a period in which, let's say, a man spends the first half of his life getting married, having children, running a business, and then the second stage in which he goes into the woods and confronts the mysteries of consciousness and meditation and death. And to paraphrase a quote from Yeats, I don't want to show up to heaven empty-handed, but there's a way in which the ascetic spiritual life can create death mongers among even the young, to emphasize the role of suffering before it's due. And I feel like in some ways there's wisdom to accepting that such things will come in time, but that there's a wisdom to accepting the natural direction and timing and the rhythm of the life sequence. And that while religion and spirituality should allow us to come to peace with suffering and death, we shouldn't necessarily preempt the question, because they should also allow us to come to peace with joy and pleasure and reverie and laughter. And so these are some thoughts that represent the kind of chaotic jumble in which I approach these daunting issues.
Well, I think we need to be cautious in talking about the life cycle, because I think this looks different for different types, and that's encoded in in the Hindu teaching, right? The householder's path is different than the yogi's path, right? So this is a little bit more like saying villagers and shamans, or any number of different analogies we could make, where for some people, normal would look accelerated to the other people, right? That they're desperate to get involved in that at an earlier and deeper degree of intensity. So bearing that in mind, I think we look at the possible gains of ascetic practice, right? Ascesis is maybe better conceived as exercise. We all know that we should be exercising more in various ways, but that exercise has to be understood as having a goal that is life affirming and even pleasurable. Often when we undergo ascetic practice, and Nietzsche talks about this very clearly in his essay on the various meanings of ascetic practice, it's different for different types. And it gets problematic where the self-abnegation of life processes becomes the goal in and of itself. And that tends to happen when the actual goal of gaining something for life from the practice is lost. Right? If you discipline your diet and physical exercise in order to feel better, that's an ascetic practice, but it's an ascetic practice with a goal that's understandable to the organism. Similarly, if you thought, I'm going to gain some kind of strength of character by undergoing certain hardships that I've freely chosen, and I think that's important. It has to be freely chosen. We know this from things like exposure therapy, that if you volunteer to touch the spider you're afraid of, that can be very helpful. But if someone throws a spider on you, that does not help your spider phobia. So if you can freely choose these self-building, self-deepening, self-constructing things with the idea that it is for something specific, that you can then evaluate whether the process is taking you closer to that or not, then you're in a pretty good position. You know, if people come to your death cult and they sort of just...
And sign up today, by the way.
Absolutely. Get involved, folks.
This is a call to action.
One of the things that can go wrong when people approach teachers, so to speak, is they have no real sense of what they want out of the engagement. And so they are available to be told to undergo practices that deviate from their own well-being and agency for no clear purpose except to be subservient and to surrender themselves. And they can't, because they don't know the goal, evaluate whether they're getting any closer to the goal. But if they had a clearer sense of what they want from that teacher, from that circumstance, from that exercise, then they would be in a better position to be able to determine whether it's an ascetic challenge that's helping them get closer, or an ascetic challenge that's merely thwarting their organism in some way.
Yeah. Now you,
but I want to put all of that aside to one side, let's say, and agree with you that the suffering that's built into reality, that you don't have to add suffering to, is the more fundamental form of suffering for transfiguring the self, right? It's a matter of making use of the suffering we already go through, and it's a dangerous or specialized task to get involved with practices or people who want to helpfully add suffering to your experience. But if you undergo your regular sufferings as regular sufferings, you don't necessarily gain from them. The spiritual esoteric lore is such that you have to do something different in order to assimilate the suffering that's built into everyday life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to say two things, which is that being just a paper cult leader, I am admittedly just kind of a piece of garbage, and don't well, that's all I wanted to say about that, I guess.
You're a piece of garbage.
The other thing I wanted to say, or rather ask you, was you, and by you I mean the disembodied body, which is your soul animus mover entity, which has sometimes been called Layman Pascal, recently wrote a piece dealing with a terrible back injury that he had to deal with. Now, as someone, again, who's spineless, I have no understanding of such things. And I'm not sure enough about the anatomy of Cayman to know if you are. But I'm wondering about that experience, which seemed to be one in which Layman leaned into the experience of the suffering that somehow was able to produce transformative insight in some way. And I wanted to know if you could speak to that.
First of all, caimans are vertebrates. But from what I understand of his Substack article, the transfiguring element of suffering needs to be discerned and intentionally leaned into in order for it to undergo some kind of shift. Now, I think we normally experience suffering as a kind of nebulous phenomenon. And it's actually not the whole situation that is the kernel of the pain. Right? There's a lot of emotional reaction. There's a lot of narrativizing. There's a lot of murk. But within all of that, there's some point, where the needle pricks you, some precise element where the heart of the suffering is, where the rest of your field of experience is trying desperately to bend itself away from that particular kernel. And it's in the intentional attempt to contact and stay in contact with that kernel that we sort of gain some extra energy, adopt a different posture toward our misery, and spring the trap in a way. So much of the suffering that's around that point becomes unnecessary if you hold that point. Now, it's not a panacea, but it is a way of thinking about suffering that transforms your relationship to it. And if we looked at this at the level of the human nervous system, we would see that whatever systems are involved in the interpretation that is the pain are then joined by other areas of the nervous system, which are doing sensing, feeling, and precise intentional discernment. And that the entanglement of these systems allows the charge to stabilize and maybe weds parts of yourself together in a more robust way. Because it's very nice to feel yourself harmonized after sitting in meditation at a beautiful meditation camp. But there's another kind of bringing yourself together that involves the kind of heat that we only get from things that actually make us feel bad. And it's very personal, I think, what makes you feel bad. Back pain, that's kind of an obvious one. But when it comes to our emotional and domestic lives, say, only we know what really hurts us. And no one can prescribe that as a general impersonal rule about what to do. And that's one of the reasons that there has to be an individualized lore of how to take advantage of your personal suffering. And I think Kierkegaard gets close to this, right? His relationships are very much organized around things that hurt him in particular, and the way he attempts to use that in order to access the transcendental condition that he associates with the symbol of the crucified human divine, I think is very suggestive of how this process can work.
Yes, the night of infinite resignation, as he put it. Layman, do you want to know what makes Adyahanzi personally sad? Do you want to know his personal pain?
Tell me.
I once had beautiful hair, locks of beautiful hair. But so many years in a cave, Cayman, it's not good. It's not good for the dendrites. Not good for the rights. That's dendrites with an apostrophe in front of it. I also don't know if dendrites have anything to do with hair. Adyahanzi is not well versed in such matters as human medicine. But more than that, it makes me think of what you were saying about this sort of holding on to this point, pain, being able to kind of move past that. And to kind of tie that back to this notion of the life cycle, I'm inclined to believe, I presume, I hypothesize that something like that experience characterizes the moment of death itself, when the very ego or organismic identity that we're holding on to and have been holding on to for our entire lives, we suddenly let go of. And I don't know how volitional that process is. I assume it's very different for different people. But there does also seem to be something volitional about it, that when you lose the desire to keep holding on, the life will flow away sooner, or something to that effect. It seems to be evidenced by certain cases I've read. But it's a notion I'm intrigued by, the sense of ego death as being sort of the point we must all come to make that kind of movement, that kind of move where we are confronted by, in some ways, the ultimate agony, which is our own existence in existential danger. And we meet that by letting go. And in some ways, I guess I'm just saying that that moment, to some degree, probably awaits us all. In Adyahanzi's case, much sooner than others. But it's an interesting consideration that built into the very fact of being a living organism is the confrontation with death. And in some ways, the spiritual moment, the experience that comes from that final gesture of finally jumping into that unknown. I guess that's all I have to say about that.
Well, there seems to be something attractive about, I was going to say your scalp, but I don't want to disabuse you of the suffering associated with hair loss, for it may have a transfigurational value. Nonetheless, you look quite lovely. There also seems to be something attractive about this notion of being a conscious participant in our final moments. Right? Many of us think that would be a very lovely thing to do, although many people don't get that opportunity. Right? If a bag of concrete falls on your head, you don't have the option of reciting the Tibetan Book of the Dead in your final moments and voluntarily relinquishing your being. I think we have the ability to get better at the internal gesture of surrender. That this is something that all the components of our organism are capable of in various ways, that descends through our evolutionary history. If we watch certain creatures in the ocean, they will retract or expand, and we need to be able to release our retraction in order to be participants in whatever aspect of the life process we happen to be going through. So that's something we can get better at. But we also shouldn't necessarily burden ourselves with some idealistic notion of the total surrender of the ego. That seems exaggerated. I think the absoluteness of surrender bedevils many people unnecessarily and makes it seem like a less natural function than it is.
Yes, well, and speaking to the absolute surrender, I think that can only occur at death, because anything less would not be death, and one can't imagine anything more absolute than the letting go of the self. And again, to beat a dead Cayman, I don't think it's particularly spiritually advantageous to try to jump the gun, as it were, to try to encounter that moment out of season, let's say. However much it might be beneficial to experience certain kinds of ego death experiences in preparation for such a final end, and also for a greater sense of awareness about what truly constitutes an ego in the first place. But I think one way to tie this all together is a deep appreciation for the fact that we do wear these masks and we play these roles, and there's something to the final unmasking, final laying down the front, the pretense, the character. And on the other side, is mystery. And whether or not finally laying down the character of the self is the last act of surrender needed to experience ultimate bliss and unity with the divine, or whether it is the final act of any form of existence whatsoever, cannot be answered in any definitive sense until that decisive moment, which I think is probably the condition that renders it so sacred and profound. It is the ultimate epistemological boundary point of any existing being, and what it means to move beyond it must remain a mystery. Now, whether or not people, sages such as Adyahanzi, who have been alive for millennia and traversed through various selves on the journey of self-exploration and discovery, can speak to that in any shamanic sense that renders wisdom to the people as a guidepost, well, that's also a mystery and an unanswered question as far as I'm concerned. Now, I say this not as myself, but as Brendan Dempsey, speaking through me as a puppet.
We, as a species, have a kind of a trite homogenizing tendency to assume that death means the same thing for all beings. We ask ourselves questions like, do men have a soul or not? As if it was necessarily the same for everyone. So we should be aware of the potential diversity that's involved in such transitions. But the question of what we mean by death is an interesting one. Heidegger makes a distinction that's sometimes phrased as death versus demise. We know what a demise is. We see organisms die. We know that this organism too shall perish. We don't know what death means because we haven't experienced it. What we mean by it then is not something whose nature we are sure of, but something that imposes a limitation on our ability to know. It is the possibility of the end of possibilities, whatever that means. Right? And it may be the case that everyone or someone passes into some other kind of imaginal existence beyond. But even in that case, which is speculated about in all the great religious traditions, even in that case, you would still have to have some relationship to this possibility of the end of possibilities. And that the fundamental limiting characteristic that imposes on you constrains you in a way that determines your ability to be an authentic participant in the process. Heidegger! Look at this. I've got two glowing red pupils in my eye.
I would like Cayman Rascal to end with a song. New York, yeah.
Caymans are very invested in classic show tunes.
That's correct. Well, Cayman Rascal, this has been deeply elucidating, very profound. I don't know if you can tell, but I've actually reached the very core of the Empyrean during the course of our conversation. And I appreciate this opportunity to make another appearance in the form of Adyahanzi, albeit speaking through the mouthpiece of my mask and character. And I look forward to seeing you in the divine face of God when I enter the final rung of paradise and take leave of my senses and recognize the fourfold vision appearing in the face of the Christ figure, beyond whose ken I proceed into eternity.
Don't go into the light. It's a trap.